Hello and welcome to Turning the Conversation to Whiteness, the third in a three-part series titled Finding Answers Together, Exploring, Explaining, and Eradicating Systemic Racism. This event is sponsored by the Division of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion with support from the Center for Cultural Pluralism. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Vermont is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples for thousands of years and is home of the Western Abenaki people. UVM honors, recognizes, and respects these peoples, especially the Abenaki, as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we virtually gather today. Now I'd like to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Krista Hagen-Howe. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I serve as the diversity educator for the Center for Cultural Pluralism. And today I will be serving as your host. After I review a few details for the day, I will then ask our three presenters to introduce themselves. And before I do that, I'd love to just talk about some logistics for today. So as you've noticed, all participants are on mute by default and only our presenters will be speaking during this event. However, we do encourage you to use the live events question and answers feature, so it's the Q&A feature, to ask questions or even share comments with other participants or our presenters. And we'll do our best to answer your questions and address your comments during today's session. However, we would like to acknowledge that given the time allotted for this event, we may not be able to address every question or comment we receive, but we did extend this session. Usually our sessions go from 12 to 1, and we are going until 1:15 today with the hopes of just being able to answer a few more questions. This session is being recorded, and the recording of the session will be available through our website, go.uvm.edu/amazing-grace, within the next few days. And this event is being live captioned by our colleagues at White Coat Captioning. And captions for this event are available at the stream text link that's in the event chat. I also just want you to get a feel of what to expect for today. And so if you've attended our other two sessions, you know the format, and today we'll be doing the same thing where we're kind of giving you a general introduction idea of what to expect, and then our presenters will speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll address as many questions as we can until we end right at 1:15 with some closing remarks. Before I introduce our wonderful presenters and have them introduce themselves, I want to talk a little bit about group agreements. We have a few agreements that we would like you all to keep in mind. These agreements are one part of Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversations About Race protocol. And the first agreement we'd like you to think about is to really do your best to stay engaged throughout today. The second is to speak your truth. The third is to be open to experiencing some discomfort. And the fourth is, as we're exploring some of these conversations and perspectives on whiteness, to really expect and accept non-closure. So now that you have an idea of how today will be formatted, I want to invite our presenters to go ahead and introduce themselves. Kyle, would you like to go ahead and get us started?
Kyle, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Pardon my muted position there. Once again, good afternoon. My name is Kyle Dodson. I use he, him, they, their pronouns, and I'm the CEO president of the Greater Burlington YMCA. I'm happy to be here today and looking forward to this conversation with all of you.
Thank you, Kyle. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Marcus. I use he, his, him pronouns. I work with a Boston organization called Community Change, though I live in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. And connection to UVM, my colleague Donna Bivens and I have been working with the Center for Health and Wellbeing for the last several years around this work.
Thank you so much. Wanda, would you like to introduce yourself and give a few opening remarks?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wanda Heading Grant, and I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Vermont, and it is my pleasure to be here with you. I have a few things that I would like to share first before we really get started, and I did not want to go any further without saying thank you. Sometimes people ask, what can they do? And sometimes it's the simplest things that they can do. And so I just really wanted an opportunity to really thank the UVM Communications area department. I also wanted to thank as well the Enterprise Technology Services, especially Peter Brooks. Thank you so much. Doctors Tiffany Spencer and Jesse Suter, thank you for being wonderful moderators. We could not have done this without you, as well as I'd like to thank President Garamella and Provost Patty Prelock in terms of they've just been great supporters and cheerleaders around this, and I appreciate your leadership as well as the deans and vice presidents. Thank you so much. And then, of course, how do I not thank Krista Hagen-Howe, thank you, and Paul Yoon and Dr. Sherwood Smith. Thank you so much to the team and everyone else in the DE&I division. It's just been wonderful. I have a few things that I wanted to say to you today. The second thing, my first thing was the thank yous. The second thing is really to just mention and talk about on June 3rd, I sent a communication out to our university campus. And I talked about my sorrow and my frustration in terms of the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis policeman, and how I felt so just hurt to my core around what had occurred. And I really wanted to desperately be able to do something. And I wanted to be able to do something very meaningful and something that was substantial for myself and for our campus community. And so we started with the Amazing Grace program, and you can find that online. And then we went to this teach-in, and this teach-in about finding answers together with the focus on systemic racism. I really feel that in order to really truly get started and have a substantial impact is that you have to understand the root, the core of the problem. We often are so eager to jump into situations and things, and that can be good at times. But I also think that you should be quickly and often informed about what you're doing. And so I come to you and, and ask you to keep doing what you're doing. What you don't understand, continue to learn and reach out. Please remember that BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color don't have all the answers, and don't look for directives from them all the time and information from them all the time. There's so much out there that we can collectively be partners on making a difference and having a change, not only in the larger world, but here in Vermont, and especially at the University of Vermont. The last thing I would just say to you is that we can't unlive a lot of the past, maybe none of the past, but we can certainly move forward and do good things. And some of you may be familiar with that concept and thought as I think about one of my elders, Maya Angelou. So, so if you're still wondering what can you do, and you want some quick answers, what I would do is direct you towards a mirror. Look at yourself. Start there. Look at the reflections. What action, what things can you do to make a difference? Start there, and I think you'll be in a good place. So enjoy what we are bringing to you. This will not be the last time. It is our last time in terms of this series, but we have plenty more thoughts and plans around bringing you wonderful, informative, and transformational programs and initiatives right here to our campus. So continue to join us. And some of you who know me well, what do I say? Let's roll, folks. Let's roll. Thank you. Krista?
Thank you so much, Wanda. So now that you have an idea of who will be speaking today, let's just quickly talk through a little bit around systemic racism. For those of you who have attended our other sessions, you may have a great idea, and that's fantastic. We just wanted to do a quick reminder for folks, and then we will really start pointing the conversation in the direction of discussing whiteness and inviting our presenters to go ahead. So, I do want to point out that there are 4 main levels of racism, right? Cultural or societal, systemic, interpersonal, and internalized. And whiteness can show up and does show up at all of these levels. And today, we're holding several conversations to really allow us to see the many ways whiteness shows up and to also see how it connects to systemic racism. I want to point out, just a couple things around systemic racism to keep in mind in our conversations today. And one of the first things I want to invite you to think about is, this idea of an established way of doing something, right? Thinking about the way things are normalized and the normalization of things, behaviors, cultures, and people, and really, the impacts that can have. And another point that I think is one of the scariest things about systemic racism is this bottom bullet point here of not requiring intentional planning and initiative to perpetuate it, but really thinking about how if we're not actively thinking about disrupting, dismantling, and interrupting systemic racism, we're probably perpetuating it. And so, as we kind of think about that, I have a quote that I want to offer for us to consider that came from a 1992 interview with The Guardian that Toni Morrison did. And in that interview, she said, "In this country, American means white. Everybody else has to hyphenate." And to understand race in the US, we have to understand whiteness. Whiteness as in normalizing the white race and constantly measuring against it as the standard, the norm, and the way things are done and expected. And also recognizing that this accepted normality shows up in everyday interactions, from institutional and governmental decisions to interpersonal interactions, and of course, internalization as well. And thinking about too of the normalization of white identities absolutely having a direct relationship to the invalidation and denormalization of non-white identities. And I think too about this concept of whiteness creates an element of racial etiquette, right? Some of these rules that are expected to follow and to go by. And for non-white folks, not going by those rules has serious detriments, harm, and even death. And so the other thing, I just want to kind of call back to this idea of systemic racism kind of being able to run by itself. Once a system and an expectation and a way of doing things are set up, it's then able to run and show up in so many interactions, systems, decisions, policies, and more. I could certainly go on for quite a while to discuss this, and I want to keep this pretty brief because I'm really excited for you all to hear from our presenters today. But what we hope that you'll experience is a moment to really think and reflect on whiteness in particular, and our speakers will dive deeper into some ideas around whiteness and ways it can and has showed up. And then we'll turn the conversation to you to explore and ask questions, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. And so at this point, I would love to invite Paul to begin his section of the presentation.
I'd like to start with a piece that was posted on the site, the National Association of African Americans in Human Resources, because I want to begin by naming something. And this was written about a month ago, maybe a little bit more than a month. Tomorrow morning, we return to another work week. We do this after days of mourning Black lives and protesting violence against Black people during a pandemic that is disproportionately killing Black people. The expectation is that we maintain quote unquote professionalism, which typically means that we must be careful not to make our non-Black colleagues feel uncomfortable. We bite our tongues and mask our tears when we are expected to engage in business as usual. We try to act normal. This is not normal. None of this should be normalized. We wait with bated breath to hear our non-Black colleagues and organizations we work for affirm that our lives matter. We wait to hear from the companies that benefit from Black dollars affirm that our lives matter. We grapple with the deafening silence from those we thought were about us. We stand in the gap between knowing our lives matter and financially supporting our family. Understand that this is the reality for many Black professionals. Understand the impact of your silence. And I think one of the ways as I think about whiteness is to get at that silence. And I think, and I hope through this conversation we're going to have today, we'll bring some of that out. And so part of that is we really don't know our own history. And that's why I started the presentation with this quote from a man named Ed Clark. It's, if I hadn't believed it, I wouldn't have seen it. And much of this work is about really examining the lenses that we have, that we view and interpret reality through, and where they came from and what they are. Another quote that that's been really important to me, and it's on my email, is that it's a Daniel Bernstein quote, and it's, education happens when you learn something you didn't know you didn't know. So I was thinking about some of my own significant learnings in this process, and there's a lot, but I'll just start with one, and that is that this idea of race is a social construct. And it's already been alluded to, but how whiteness is normalized, is normatized. In fact, if you think, for a lot of people in my experience, if we say we're going to be talking about race, the assumption is we're going to be talking about Black people or Blackness. When Toni Morrison writes a novel, it's a novel about race. When any white writer writes a novel, it's a novel about reality. It really came out for me, if you remember, a number of years ago when Justice Sotomayor was up for confirmation, and her race, particularly, and her gender were questioned, and how that was going to impact her decisions. And I was so proud to be a white guy at that time, because it was so clear that for those of us that are white, our racial identity and our gender identity and our identities have no influence on how we look at the world. I say that, I hope people are aware that I'm making a joke about that, but that whiteness is so normalized that for me, my reality is just normal reality. And so a big learning in this idea that race is a social construct is that if race is a social construct, then my race, my quote unquote race, I'll say that, has been constructed as well. I've been racialized, and that's had a profound impact on those lenses that I was talking about how I see and interpret reality, how I think of myself, how I think of others, how I think about public policy, how I think about everything. And so the reality is that when I'm here in the Northeast Kingdom and I'm sitting with all white people, I'm in highly racialized space. Race is happening all the time, and we never even see it. We never even think about it. It's the ideology that we swim in. It's the water that we swim in. So we know, and I could go into a lot of detail about this, but that race is not a biological reality. While the way we look, our physical appearance, our skin color is genetically determined, there's no underlying genetic reality to the groups that we have created or we have assigned different races to. James Baldwin said that no one is white before they came to America. And it's obvious here, he's not saying that people, there are people of different quote unquote colors, but what he is saying is says that unless you live in a society that recognizes these differences as socially relevant, they don't exist. But while there's no biological reality to race, it's very real socially and politically and economically. So I'd like to spend some time thinking about whiteness and how it was constructed. And I want to go back to, we can go back to pre-Columbus even. We can talk about the justifications of, particularly from the church, but from political justifications for exploration and conquest. And, you know, we can go back and talk about the doctrine of discovery, which essentially established a spiritual and political and legal justification for the colonization and seizure of lands of people who were not Christian. And so I want to begin with the way we talk about white supremacy in our work, because I think when a lot of people hear the concept of white supremacy, they think we're talking about, they go to skinheads, or they go to the Klan, or they go to Charlottesville, and that's a reality. But when we're talking about white supremacy, we say that white supremacy is a system of economic and social exploitation, domination, and marginalization of those constructed as people of color or other than white. It is held in place by militarization and other forms of violence, including the poverty they create. It depends on a hierarchy of race that constructs those defined as black as the bottom, those defined as white as the top, those who are indigenous as disappeared, other people of color as dangerous, expendable, and or foreign, and quote unquote white people who challenge the system as fanatics or traitors. And I think that's another reason we really like the term BIPOC, because it really names that history when we're talking about Black, indigenous, and other people of color. And if you can go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to, so as we think about this system, we go back to Dr. King's triple evils. Dr. King talked about the triple evils of poverty, militarism, and racism. And my colleague Donna Bivens made this connection a number of years ago. But so the reality is what we have here, Europeans came to this land, they wanted stuff, right? And then that ties in to the three poisons of Buddhism that keep us from enlightenment on the right-hand side of this column. But so they wanted stuff, that's greed. You can't just come and take people's land or their labor. You have to, it takes violence and militarism, and that corresponds in the three poisons with hatred. And finally, in order to do that, you need to justify it. And so the justification of that is racism and white supremacy, and that's the delusion. So from here, I want to go back, and if you think about it, then that people think that race created racism, that race prejudice is what created racism. But the reality is it's the other way around. We wanted land, we wanted resources, we wanted cheap labor, and then we created the inferiority of race. So when our land first started getting colonized, we could take it back to Jamestown. And in Jamestown, the first recorded case, and this is, we know that the Africans were here way before this time, but the first recorded case is 19 Africans coming off of a Dutch slave ship and coming into Jamestown. And when they came into Jamestown, there may have been some skin prejudice there, but they were not seen, they were treated as indentured servants. They were treated the same way as the impoverished whites who were coming over as indentured servants. They could work off their indenture, they could own land, they could vote, they could do all of those things. And so as we move through the 1600s, we begin to see a major shift. And that's what I'd like to talk about, because really the story of race in this country is the story of labor. And so as we move through the 1600s, we see differences being created between whites and blacks. And so the first case in 1640, an African, and again, I'm using John Punch. It wasn't clear what country in Africa he came from. We often, just conflate Africa with a country. It's a continent. But he and two white indentured servants escaped. They were captured, and in the court case, the two white indentured servants had their indentures increased. John Punch was given a sentence of enslavement for life. It's the first recorded case where that happens. It's a separation of white and black, and we see several laws happening. Laws around intermarriage. An interesting law. Some of you may know, but in English law, the status of the child was based on the status of the father. But here in Virginia and in the colonies, that's changed the status of the child is the status of the mother. And if you think about what that means, we know that history that, you know, African women who are being raped by their owners, their children would be enslaved. So as we go into the 1600s, we begin to see these multi-class, multiracial rebellions, and they start around the 1660s, and they culminate with Bacon's Rebellion in the 1670s. And in Bacon's Rebellion, and I don't want to glorify Nathaniel Bacon, because a lot of this rebellion was really about their access to you know, one of the issues is people indentured servants get freed, they need land. And so this was really about taking native and indigenous land. So that's I'll put that aside, but it was a 9-month rebellion. They burnt the tobacco fields, they burnt Jamestown down. The ruling class saw that this could not continue, and they very clearly and very quickly, if you look at legislative decisions and legal decisions, we can see changes in laws that very clearly separate whites and blacks. And this is really, you know, they needed a consistent labor force, and they couldn't have one if that force was banding together to challenge their authority. So coming out of this, many laws, I have no time to go into this history in any detail, but many laws were coming out of this, laws about intermarriage, slave codes, slave patrols, and many of you have been hearing recently how the slave patrols are really our first police force. And if we look at what it was saying to people, it was saying to whites, it was saying to poor whites, we're going to put you in charge here. There's a psychological, you know, there's a psychological sense of the meaning of that. And so whites are continually getting messages, and they're both material and psychological, that say that you're closer to us. They're getting messages that divide them from blacks. And so as we think about this, the message to white, and Tim Wise says this, he says, you know, we're going to let you put our uniform on and sometimes sit on the bench, but you're never going to get in the game. By 1691, we have a definition of white, and we have a constructed definition of race in law. And whites weren't given much, but they were given enough to ensure their allegiance. What W.E. Du Bois calls the psychological wages of race. And so this creates, rather than creating a multiracial coalition of people who had common interests, it creates a multi-class coalition of white people. And so really the history of this is wealthy white men dividing and conquer, creating policies that cause division and conquer. And so what we really have here is the emergence of the creation and the maintenance of whiteness becomes crucial in facilitating economic growth and capitalism. Racism and capitalism are deeply intertwined. Baptiste's book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, really looks at this. But at the same time, the system of enslavement is developing, capitalism is developing. And there's something else that's happening here. Jumping ahead, one of the first things that was passed in the national legislature was the Naturalization Act of 1791. And, you know, they were sitting around saying, we have this great land, we know people are going to want to come here. Which people do we want coming? And essentially what they said, and this was held in place for 130 years, they said that only white Europeans can become citizens. And that was one of many massive affirmative action programs for white people. In my own reality, all of my grandparents came here in the early part of the last century, the Polish Jews and Lithuanian Catholics on either side of the family. And even though they faced a lot of discrimination, they could become citizens, they could own property, they had more access to wealth and all of those things because of that. It's what George Lipsitz calls the possessive investment in whiteness. Moving into the 1800s, the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act lasted from 1862 to 1934. 270 million acres, about 10% of US land, was given away to about 1.5 million Americans. and it was families of both born in the U.S. and immigrants. Only about 4,000 or 5,000 Black families received that benefit. In the year 2000, it was calculated that the number of descendants of families that got land was estimated to be 46 million people. About a quarter of the adult population at that time can trace their family wealth and property ownership to that policy. Again, a massive affirmative action program for white people. And then going on later into this century, we look at FHA policies and housing policies that I don't have time to go into, but federal government policies combined with banking and real estate policies created the racial geography of the country between 1933 and 1964, $120 billion in federal subsidies, 98.9% or 98.5% of those subsidies went to white people. It's why today we have a racial wealth gap anywhere between, depending on which study you look at, anywhere between 10 and 20 times in the United States. In Boston, the mean net wealth for whites is $245,000. The mean net worth for Blacks is $8. So there's this possessive investment in whiteness. At the same time, I want to go back now, and I want to go back to Thomas Jefferson, the man who probably most embodies the contradiction that our nation was founded in. And Jefferson says in Notes on the State of Virginia, "I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the Blacks, whether originally distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to whites in the endowments both of body and mind." And Jefferson sets on, he basically says, I'm postulating this, but it's up to science to prove this. And science develops, there's a whole history then of science and of anthropology of just the justification for the supremacy of white people. At the same time, the system of enslavement is evolving. We often think of the system of enslavement as just it's been the same, but by 1865, by 1860, there's 4 million African descended people enslaved in the country. Their worth is greater than all of manufacturing, all of the railroads. And there's, again, I don't have time to go into this, but it's the basis for the wealth of the nation. It drives the industry in the North. It creates investments. There's insurance policies. All the major investment firms, all the major insurance companies are involved in this process. So there's this large systemic economic reality to this. And so I'm gonna stop here in terms of the history, but ultimately, when we're talking about whiteness or white culture isn't a culture of, it's not an ethnic culture. It's really it's a political culture that's about domination. And James Baldwin said it well. He said, "The only thing whites have that Black people need is power, and nobody holds on to power forever." And it's very clear. He's saying here, there's nothing essential about race. There's no relationship between race and athletic ability or intellectual ability. The only difference is that difference of power. And so that brings me to the next slide that I just want to put up quickly here. So when we're talking about a system, this is a little bit different than what was shown earlier, but it's really the same thing. But we talk about the system operating on these 4 dimensions: internally, interpersonally, institutionally, and culturally. So this system of racism is impacting all of these interconnected dimensions. And I want us to think about particularly what is the relationship of race in your lives? What has been the impact of race? How has this living in a system of racism influenced the internal lenses that you use to impact reality? And what's the meaning of that? And how does that connect to all of these other dimensions? We live in this culture where we live in these institutions. We take this all in internally. This impacts our interpersonal relationships, both among our own race and across race. So we've had 400 or 500 years of this. How could it not be living in us? How could it not be in our heads? As Raphael Ezekiel says, that if you live next to a cement factory, you're going to be breathing in cement dust all your life, and you take that in and you breathe it in, and it becomes part of you. And for me, that's been an important piece of this because I wasn't born into this system. I wasn't responsible for creating this system. But once I learned about it, once I began to understand the system and this history, it was no longer a choice. I no longer had the leisure of being clueless about it. Now it's a choice. And so a big piece of this work is to really, as Wanda was saying earlier, is to really think about our own learning around this issue. And I'm going to leave you with one other quote here, which is the next slide. And it's a quote from Eduardo Bonilla Silva. Racially minoritized people see whiteness all the time and in everything in you. Indeed, it is a prevailing entity. Although you, meaning people who look like me, have been socialized to deny whiteness, you too know it exists. Denying its existence offers comfort and a sense of innocence, hence feelings of white guilt that emerge when whiteness is named. When you refuse to acknowledge whiteness or shy away from it because of the discomfort, you engage with what Bonilla Silva calls racism without racists. And I had one other piece, but I'll end here because I've been talking a little bit too long. Thank you.
Go ahead, Kyle.
Okay, just thought there was a transition, but I'll just jump right in. Sorry about that. Good afternoon again, everyone. This is going to be perhaps a bit of an experiment. When I'm speaking to groups, I tend to prefer taking on more of a conversational effect. Even in a room of 100 people, I find it's possible when you can see people, respond to their faces, look them in the eye. I think there's something that can be achieved in terms of a conversation. It's a little more challenging with technology, but we're going to give it a go. First is whenever I'm talking, a lot of times when I'm listening to other presenters and reflecting in the moment, things come up. And on this divide that Paul spoke so well to, the idea of there being something around blackness and whiteness that is a fiction, most of it from a biological standpoint, but it's very real from other perspectives. And one thing that's always struck me as I've moved through life is how there's this awareness, I would say a much greater awareness among folks of color, particularly black folks, because we live the oppression and discrimination on a daily basis. We're acutely uber aware of it. And oftentimes many white folks are not. And so there's this whole conversation that happens within the black community. So I was thinking of some terms I can remember from my youth, this idea of quiet as it's kept. So quiet as it's kept is there are things that we will discuss within the black community that we won't necessarily discuss publicly. And then it moved to me to some things that are kind of tongue-in-cheek axioms or adages within the black community that interestingly really just came up to, for me or re-emerged for me today thinking about this. One is my sister and I often do this, but it's a black folks thing. When you see something where where a black person does something that is less than ideal, socially inappropriate, problematic, I'll call my sister and will race to be the first one to tell the other person, that's your people. And we're teasing and we're associating, but it strikes me there's nothing like that in the white community. When a white person acts, there's not this sense that that person is somehow acting for the group and impacting the perception of the group and how the group moves through life. It's just individual. Bill does whatever, Susie does whatever, and it just is. But oftentimes, when a black person acts, it speaks for the whole community, particularly when it's on the negatively perceived side of action, as opposed to the positive. And then the last one that I thought of is when I was young, I can remember you'd be talking with someone, and when someone put themselves above others, they were judgmental, critical, or took a holier than thou position, oftentimes one would say, that's mighty white of you, to sort of put them down or point out to them that they were being pompous. And I thought, once again, that's an interesting thing. And it speaks to, I think, what we just heard about power, dynamics, etc. So I thought I might just start off with that. So another thing, I thought it was interesting to end with the idea of his awareness of his whiteness. And once you have awareness, you no longer have a ability to be innocent. But I think we have an overall problem in dealing with this issue in that we really don't have a lot of subjective understanding of what it means to be white. And by saying that, I'm saying that I think it's generally accepted that we look to the people who are experiencing something to tell us about that experience, and that there's something limited, even illegitimate, about an outsider talking about someone else's subjective experience. But what we have is folks of color have thought about and experienced whiteness all the time, and we have no shortage of opinions about what it is. But to the degree that so many whites are just in the process of becoming more woke, more aware about this status of whiteness, we don't have a lot of people moving around talking about what it means to be inside of that identity, because so much has been done to make that identity normative and invisible. So people just go through life saying, I am what I am, I work at this place, I have this family, but they're not giving us or even having their own subjective understanding of that identity. And I think that is another thing that challenges us. So quickly, when I thought about this, I think there are a couple things that make it challenging for us to move through this at the individual human level. And I think that part of that's human psychology, that for me, the 400 plus years of oppression and persecution, murder, etc., is ultimately about fear and anxiety. And it's almost like the perfect setup, the perfect crime was this creation of this white-black dynamic, so that it is insidious and it just perpetuates itself. And therefore, it's become this thing that has a sort of presence all its own. But I think at its base, oftentimes it's about fear and anxiety. And blackness has been set up as the ultimate boogeyman. When you're in a tough spot, and I'll come back to that, we can see what happens in some of the things that are playing out in interpersonal reactions. But when you're in this fear, back against the wall, tough spot, and blackness is available to you to strike out as and to present as the problem, oftentimes white folks will do that because it's ever available to do so. But I think it's helpful to remember that in many ways it is a fear anxiety response that just has a readily available something to help alleviate that sense of fear. I read a book. I don't know how many people just share good books. There was a book back in the late 90s, I think, called All Souls Day. And it was a white gentleman who grew up in South Boston. And what I think it articulated really well is the fact that if you know Boston geography, you've got South Boston, which is pretty much pressed up against Roxbury, not far from Dorchester. So two of the blackest and brownest neighborhoods in Boston being Dorchester and Roxbury, and Southie right next to it. And many of the circumstances in all three of those communities in the 70s and 80s, where you had breakdown of manufacturing and other ways of people making money and supporting a family and other dynamics, made it so that the poverty, the crime, the drug use, the family breakdown were pretty similar across all three communities. But this gentleman, in a way that was almost made him out to be a traitor, he pointed out that his belief that one of the reasons South Boston suffered so terribly, and in the 90s there was a horrible suicide and opiate addiction epidemic, and was that what white South Bostoners told themselves, their narrative is that we can't have those problems because those are the problems that black and brown people have. And therefore, they couldn't own the problems, they couldn't address the problems, and the community at some level was literally imploding, crumbling from the inside because it had these toxins, this cancer in its midst, and it couldn't address it because of the narrative that it told itself. And I was just really impressed by that book to help understand more of the history and how deep these narratives are of who we are and how they impede us in our movement. Now, what I'm interested in mostly in this conversation and everything moving forward is how do we go forward? How do we improve the situation? And I think that what that's going to require, which is going to be difficult, is a certain amount of empathy and compassion. It's going to be both ways. It's going to be from those of us who've suffered for years and years, BIPOC folks, but also it's going to take that from white folks to themselves. You'll often hear folks of color say the last thing we need is guilt or pity or self-flagellation. Those just aren't very productive. They don't change things very much. They don't move us forward. And at the end of the day, they're very self-centered. It's about oneself, right? That those feelings are really about how I feel about me, and they end up being ultimately very self-centered, even if they're coming from a place of feeling badly. So just some things that I think. One is the individual versus the collective. I have empathy for the fact that if you're the individual, working poor, working class white person who's struggling on a daily basis to put food on the table, take care of your family, just move through life, I can't imagine that always feels like a very privileged position. And you can even look around you and see folks of color who certainly on the surface, the car they drive, the job they have, the house they have, appear to have a great deal more privilege than you. And if you're that person who has not had the education, has not been part of the conversations about the history, etc., I can see it being difficult to be pointed at as a racist, as the problem, and as someone who's keeping people down when that doesn't feel, you don't have a palpable sense of that experience. And so I think the ability to understand in our national conversation about this, that we're talking about systems, we're talking about collectives, we're talking about group dynamics, is the place where racism, the power dynamic, really plays out. And oftentimes the individual to individual interaction can look a lot different. And the dynamics that play out interpersonally can feel different. Certainly folks of color can be discriminatory and biased and prejudiced as much as anyone else. But it's really difficult in this country, I would argue impossible, for any group of folks of color to systematically deny access and impose power on white folks in a way that impedes something about how they move through life, job, food security, housing, etc. And so that distinction is, I think, something we need to make and help people understand that, because I think the conversation will go that much better. I also think it's important to not, I think we sometimes specifically demonize, we act like whiteness and the ills that are perpetrated on whiteness are some specific set of human behaviors. I personally don't believe that. I think they are contextualized and historically created, as we learned earlier, just like the Nazis. I don't think Nazi Germans were a different sort of human being. They were human beings that had certain circumstances. They had a leader who was an incredible manipulator, and horrific things happened under some of those human beings. But I would be very careful to be another human being looking at that and accepting myself, thinking that myself or another group of humans might not fall prey to similar circumstances and behave in really problematic ways. I think history tells us that, unfortunately, all of us as humans can be pretty base and behave in problematic ways. So I think we need to avoid essentializing these characteristics. Next, I just want to point out what I believe in our current moment is a particularly helpful example to look at to understand some of what's happening in this whiteness, blackness, or whiteness versus BIPOC reality in a way that might be more instructive and a little bit easier to pick apart. And that is, rather than looking at something which is all too common, very sensational, horrific, like George Floyd's murder before us in 8+ minutes. There's so many of the tropes and ways we have of thinking about this problem that are present in that I believe can distract us from some of the underlying issues we want to look at. So instead of looking at a circumstance like that, I've been growing more interested in what happened between Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper in Central Park, in the ramble section of the park, where Christian Cooper asked Amy to put her dog on a leash, as all signs indicated one should do. She reacted defensively immediately. He very calmly started filming it, thinking this could be a situation that might benefit from being captured and recorded. And she then proceeded to escalate to the point where she called the police, was very specific about him being a problem because he's an African-American male, claiming she was being assaulted, and really creating quite a scene, handling her dog in a way that was rough and problematic. And why I think that's interesting is, and I've heard some people give some data that there's not much evidence that Amy Cooper was a virulent racist. She didn't have much past of attending white supremacy rallies. She didn't have blogs where she spewed racist thoughts. My sense is she was fairly run-of-the-mill New York upper middle class white woman. She found herself in a tight position, per my earlier comments. She was anxious. At some level, she was very defensive. She knew she was wrong. She knew the dog should be on a leash. She didn't want to be called out. She certainly didn't want to be called out by a black man. And then I think, without her really having much conscious thought about it, she went to the deep dark place of race and thought she could use that to get protection. She was certain that if the police came, they didn't show up during the time those two were there, but I think she was certain that if they did come, they would have come to her aid. And in the process, she really upended her life. She lost a very well-paying job. She had to get rid of her dog. She got death threats, pretty high consequences for being unconscious about this thing that rested inside of her, this animus towards black folks and the way it could emerge. So I present that to people. I encourage people to go back and look at that situation, because I think it was really, I think Krista mentioned the idea of a mirror. I think it was a mirror for Amy Cooper. She, what Christian Cooper did by putting up that camera and staying there pretty placidly, unintimidated, and just allowing her to go off on her own, she was really looking in a mirror at some ugliness that resided in her that she was not aware of. So I want to close out, because I really think the question and answer period is important, and just offer, I'm pretty sure it's been something that's dealt with at UVM. I know I encountered it at Champlain College, and I think that is that we need to move through this work that we're doing as a nation, here as UVM, as a community of Burlington, et cetera, in an appreciative inquiry way. I think the more we can take into account the fact that we're dealing with human psychology, it happens to be around this most sensitive and difficult issue, but I think the reason appreciative inquiry took hold is that an approach that isn't punitive, that isn't finger pointing, that isn't constantly critical, that isn't judgmental, and isn't causing people to feel badly all the time, just has better outcomes when you're dealing with humans. And so, as hard as it is, I think we need to try to adopt that sort of perspective, trying to move through in a way that is generative, that moves us forward. It doesn't mean we can't point out that which is problematic, but adopt a sort of constructive criticism perspective so we look at it in ways that allow us to move forward. So with that, I'll end. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kyle. And thank you, Paul, as well, for both of your presentations. What we'd like to do now is shift into our Q&A session. I know we have some questions coming in, so we'll start to answer those. If you have more questions, comments, please put those into the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. And it looks like the first question is for Paul. So Paul, if you would like to read the question and answer, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get it in the, we've gone down below it now in the chat. Let's see where it is. I'm sorry. Here it is. So there's two questions that that came across. One is, given the complexity of what is involved in both the construct of whiteness and also what is more commonly becoming referred to as white supremacy culture, what do these presenters, and I think this is for both of us, think the most important question to ask right now is, where do we start right now if you want to truly address equity? So it's a very complicated question, and there's not a simple answer to it. But we are in a revolutionary moment, I think, right now. There's some amazing things that are happening. A lot of the work that's been done over the past 20 or 25 years all over the country, I think, is coming to fruition. There's more people talking about these issues, more people wanting to learn and act around these issues. The New York Times bestseller list, I think 14 out of the 15 combined paperback and ebooks are books that we've been using and talking about for a long time. So one of the questions that comes up for me around this is, where's this going to go? And we talk about the possessive investment in whiteness and the psychological investment in whiteness. Are white people going to stay in this, or is it going to be a couple months in and back to normal? That's an important question for me. But the other answer that I want to give is, I think that and as Wanda alluded to earlier, that we have to start doing this work. We have to be willing to do this work ourselves. When I first got into this work, I realized that there was a whole lot I didn't know. And in fact, it's interesting, and Robin DiAngelo talks about this. He said, I've never met a white person who doesn't have opinions about race and racism, right? But and it was very clear to me. My colleague Patty DeRosa says that a lot of people have opinions about racism, but very few people know much about it. And so part of the questions we need to be asked is, what's the work that we need to do? And for those of us that are white, we can do everything I learned about race and racism, I either learned from BIPOC people or from people who learned it from them. However, I don't have to have them there to bleed for me to understand this. There's all kinds of ways that I can do this work. And the other important thing is, the work isn't just for my own self-improvement. That work has to be tied to finding ways to take action. And we have a saying that we use, and that is that choice is a function of expanded awareness. And the more we start looking at this, the more we start looking at ourselves, the more we start understanding the history, the more we start understanding the system, it gives us more options and more opportunities to be taking action. And that action has to be done, for those of us that are white. It has a lot of work to be done with our own people, our own families, our own places of work. We need to be stepping up. But the other piece, it needs to also be done following the leadership of people of color and in multiracial coalitions and collaborations. Do you want me to? I'll stop there and go.
Hello, I'm going to answer a question. Let me read it to folks first. Question: what do you think about the importance of reparations, and what role do you think institutions and individuals beyond just our federal government have to play? I think that question, certainly for me, connects to the prior question about the complexities involved in this topic and in our current moment. It's an incredibly complex time, and I would say that reparations is an incredibly complex issue. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but it does occur to me that as we move forward, so much of the difficulty, the pain, the suffering happen in sort of the affective realm, the interpersonal realm, the psychological realm, but so much of the ability to address things will happen in the political realm. And that's a very different place. And it does not strike me that we can single-handedly or unilaterally change the laws of politics because we're dealing with this issue. We have people, we have government, we have voting, we have things. There are vetoes and ways that people can resist if the movement does not happen in a politically savvy and strategic way. So I think that with reparations, there has to be a lot of thought. On the one hand, on the former idea I said, I think it's unassailable. Certainly for all the things, much of which Paul outlined for us, some issue of repairing is morally necessary, financially necessary, socially necessary, historically necessary. That's on the justice side. But I think one of many examples of the fact that sometimes in the political realm, the justice that is warranted is not received is South Africa. Truth and Reconciliation was a really tough political compromise. And so I hope it doesn't feel like I'm dodging the question, because I certainly think the idea of repair is necessary, but doing the repair in a strategic way is important. Now, one thing that I think is part of this is what is the larger thing, and that is white folks understanding that this is white folks' issue. So white folks, I don't think, should think about it as repairing something for folks of color. It should be thought of as repairing the nation, repairing our collective soul and psyche. This is a bane on all of our existences. It impedes our growth and impedes our ever coming close to realizing the incredible dream of our American democracy. So that sort of shift might be helpful, move to an investment, because there will be change, and that change, if something about reparations were to happen, will take resources from one place and redistribute them. Now, whether that redistribution is thought of as loss and something taken away, or thought of more like, I hope most of us think of our parenting, it is an investment. Parenting is ludicrously expensive, as someone with 3 children in college can attest to. But I think we think of those things as an investment that's positive and forward moving. I think we could think of reparations in the same way.
Paul, don't forget to go off mute.
Sorry. There's a question that came up about Vermont, and the question is, where does Vermont fit into this concept of whiteness? Are we in a bubble? I want to say a few things. Going back to what Kyle was just saying, I think for me, if those of us that are white don't understand that we have self-interest in this, then I don't know where we go. There's a wonderful saying attributed to an Aboriginal woman that basically said, if you want to come and work with me to help me, so be it. Don't worry about it. But if you want to come, I'm paraphrasing here, but if you want to come because you understand that your liberation is deeply entwined with mine, then let us work together. And the reality is, when we look at this system of white supremacy, it is actually destroying the planet. And so we need to really take that in. In terms of Vermont, I first want to say that, and I didn't get a chance to talk about this earlier, when we talk about, we've asked probably well over 10,000 people over the last number of years how they understand race and racism, and the vast majority of people, and particularly white people, but not only white people, have an understanding of racism, a conceptual understanding is happening on that internal interpersonal dimension. They see racism as something that people, oftentimes they might say prejudice and discrimination based on race, but they see it's what we think and what we do, as opposed to a systemic structural analysis that we've been talking to. And those two understandings have profound meaning in terms of the way you think about and see the world. If you think that racism is individual and internal, and somebody starts using it, so say you did something racist, you think about how you're going to take that. But if you understand that you're operating in this system, and in fact, how could you not be doing and saying and thinking things that are racist? It's a whole different reaction, and we see that playing out all the time in public conversations when people are using those terms and they think they're talking about the same thing. They're not, and they don't understand each other. So when we come to Vermont, the reality is that Vermont is part of the system that we're operating in this nation. Systemic racism happens, it's nested, it's like a fractal. It happens at every institution we function in, it happens in every community we function in, it happens in every county, every state, it happens throughout the country. So we're all swimming in that. And in fact, one thing, if you talk to pretty much any person of color, by POC person in Vermont, they will say that we're not living in a bubble around these issues. That's the reality. But when we think about this institutionally, we think about our education system, what's being taught, who determines what's taught, who's teaching it. When we think about our healthcare system, when we think about the racial disparities in incarceration in Vermont, all of those things are playing out. We're swimming in this system. Systemic racism is operating in Vermont, and it's operating very well. Vermont isn't the whitest or the second whitest state in the nation by accident, right? There's a history that leads to it. It's not because Black people and other people of color don't like the cold, right? And so I think we need to understand that we're not living in a bubble, and we also, based on the reality of our demographics, we need to see what does anti-racism work look like in predominantly white spaces. What's the work that white people need to do in vastly majority white spaces? And I think that's an important piece, because another one of my favorite Tim Wise pieces is he talks about, he said that many white people say that, or a lot of white people say they have many, quote unquote, many Black friends. And he says, well, many is more than a couple. And so he said, if that's the reality, and given our demographics, then Black people must be going to an awful lot of cookouts, right? They must be awful. All they're doing is like hanging out with us. And so, there's this reality that we're living in, and the system of racism is impacting us all here in lily white Vermont in the deep north.
Okay. I just want to quickly, because I think it's interesting, connected to Paul's question of the whiteness of our state and what that does to us in terms of how we address this issue. I was with a friend going through a neighborhood and pointing out that the neighborhood was a beautiful neighborhood, a pretty neighborhood, a place that for many reasons you could see someone wanting to live there. And I was lamenting that I always feel torn in neighborhoods like that, thinking that if tomorrow 10 Black families could move into the neighborhood, our history would suggest some number of the white families would move out. And this person I was with was kind of shocked and hurt by that idea, and was very defensive, did not believe that to be true. And then they pointed out specific houses where they knew the people and said, that's not true for that family, not true for that family, not true for that family. So I kind of stepped back and I said, it's interesting the vehemence with which you're defending, when I'm curious, on what grounds do you know that? Just that they're progressive people who talk in a way that seems like they wouldn't do it? I would imagine, or I'm going to guess, that none of them has ever lived in a Black neighborhood. Few of them have close Black contact. So it's easy to say they wouldn't do it when we have no idea, because that family's never been presented. And it's not so much to demonize them and say it's definitely true, but I was interested and wanted to interrogate why this friend of mine needed to go to bat for these people, when the appropriate answer would have been, I just don't know. I wish that weren't true, but I don't know. But there was strong conviction about it not being true, and I wanted that individual to think about where that came from and what their need was to address that. So once again, the question, do you think that there is any value to segregating students by racial identity within our UVM diversity courses? Are there ways that we can support our BIPOC students or student employees without hitting them over the heads with our performative anti-racist work? So to take the question straight on, yes, I do think there's some value in segregating students, but that value, I would argue, is not without cost. So the challenge we have, which we keep coming, I think, back to it again and again, is the complexity and the interrelatedness of all of these issues under this history of white oppression and racism. My personal opinion is the ideal of why we might even begin to warrant the kind of cost that higher ed is the intermingling, is the connection. We're seeing that now in this online period. So much, I think, of the richness, the texture of what is the value of that experience gets lost when we can't mingle and rub elbows like that. So the contortions that we go through to support BIPOC students, because of the history and because of the ongoing issues, are necessary to support those students. But I think it compromises what the endeavor should be about, because we continue to have these issues. So we're left, I believe, in this damned if you do, damned if you don't. Segregation and giving people an opportunity, safe spaces, I might say, better than segregation, is warranted and necessary. But I think it creates new dynamics. I think it can further the distance that students in that space are feeling, because their experience in the space, in the diversity course, if it's just BIPOC people, can be very different from their other experience. And when you're young and developing, you're 19, 20, 21, you're developing your identity, you're developing a sense of the world, you're being reinforced with something positive and necessary in the diversity courses, but then you're juxtaposing that with something outside, where that outside isn't privy to what happens in that space, isn't getting the advantage of that, and it just creates, I think, this tension that can be really difficult to hold and creates a new problem. The old problem might have been being out there and feeling alienated and unsafe, but now you've got this new psychological problem. So for me, it comes back to doing the work of deconstructing and tearing down our context of oppression and racism, so that we don't need to do these contortions, which I think create different sets of problems.
And I'd just like to build on that. One of the things I think it gets often, one of the pieces, I don't think it's necessarily behind that question, but we don't understand that UVM is white space. David Roediger tells a story. He was teaching a class at the University of Missouri, and a white student kind of said, well, why do we have a Black Cultural Center? Why don't we have a white cultural center? And David, so he asked the question. So we said, what would you put it in? The only thing the kid could think of is Elvis. And so, Nell Irvin Painter talks about white identity. We didn't have time to get into this really, but she says that one of the things she says is that a major problem is that there's the inadequacy of white identity. And she says, like, whiteness is on a toggle switch between bland nothingness and racial hatred, right? And so, whiteness hasn't been a static concept. We have a sense of a changing, and we have a sense of the transition between kind of quote unquote Negro to Afro-American to African-American but we don't have any sense that in our past whites were highly racialized. There were something like 50 different racial groups of white people. And so, and by the time we get to World War II, that begins to shift, and all ethnicities kind of melt into whiteness. But we need to, it's so much the norm at UVM that I'm sure that a lot of the white kids don't even, they don't even notice it. It's just reality. And so I think it's important to name that. And for that reason, the importance of affinity spaces and that type of work that needs to be done. But I agree that can be problematic as well.
All right. Thank you so much to Kyle and Paul for taking some time to answer some of these questions. I also want to thank our incredible audience for all of the questions that you have provided us. We wanted to get to all of them, but as you can imagine, with all of the questions that we've been receiving, we haven't been able to cover every question. And unfortunately, this is all the time that we have today. So on behalf of the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and the Center for Cultural Pluralism, I would like to thank all of you again for attending today's teach-in. And I would like to thank our presenters and all of the people behind the scenes, our moderators, our captioners, our producers, for helping to put this event together. If you'd like more information or for resources for further education, please go to go.uvm.edu/amazing-grace. And we also want to make sure that you know that we do have an evaluation that we would love for you all to complete to let us know how this is going. We have it up on the screen now, and we'll put it in the chat, but we'd love your feedback on what you thought of this presentation, what you would like to see in future presentations. And again, on behalf of all of my colleagues, I want to thank the audience for being here, and I hope you all take care. Have a great day.